The horn sounded before Alira Voss even reached the hall, and something in her chest told her to turn back before it was too late. She did not turn back. The autumn gathering had drawn every pack elder, every ranking wolf, and every noble family from 3 territories into the great stone hall of Ashgrove Castle, and the air inside was thick with pine smoke and anticipation. Alira moved through the crowd in her healer's gray, the only person in the room not dressed for celebration, and found her place near the eastern pillar, where she always stood during formal gatherings, close enough to see him, far enough not to be seen standing too close. Cale Ashgrove stood on the raised dais at the far end of the hall, and even after 3 years at his side, the sight of him still did something to her breath. He wore the black and silver of his line, his dark hair pushed back from his face, his shoulders carrying the weight of a kingdom the way other men carried nothing at all. He was the Alpha King. He commanded 4 territories and the loyalty of thousands, and 2 nights ago, in the quiet of his private study, he had held her hand across a table covered in maps, and told her that when the winter treaties were settled, he wanted the whole kingdom to know what she already knew. She had believed him. That was her mistake, if it could be called one. She had let herself believe. The steward struck his staff against the stone floor 3 times, and the hall fell silent. Alira watched Cale straighten, watched him draw in a breath the way he always did, before he said something he had rehearsed, and for one foolish, hopeful second, her heart lifted toward her throat. Then the side doors opened, and Seraphine Duskmore walked in. She was beautiful in the effortless way that only came from generations of power behind a bloodline, dressed in deep blue silk that matched the crest of her father's territory, her chin lifted with the confidence of a woman who had never once doubted her place in a room. She crossed the floor toward the dais without hesitation, without a single glance at the crowd, because she did not need their approval. She already had his. Alira's hand found the pillar beside her and pressed flat against the cold stone. Cale reached for Seraphine's hand. "Tonight," he said, and his voice carried through the hall, the way it always did when he spoke as king, rather than as the man Alira had known in private. "I present to you the woman who will stand beside me, as Luna of these territories. Seraphine Duskmore, daughter of Alpha Rowan Duskmore, whose alliance will bring peace between our lands for generations to come." The hall erupted. Cups were raised. Someone near the front began the old chant that Pax used to bless a coming union, low and rhythmic, and it spread through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Seraphine's father stepped forward from among the nobles, his face lit with the particular satisfaction of a man who had just won something enormous, and clasped Cale's forearm in the old greeting between allies. Alira did not move. She had spent 3 years learning how to keep her face still, even when her body screamed to react. It was part of what made her good at her work. When a wolf came to her with a wound so deep the muscle showed through, she did not flinch, because a healer who flinched made the patient believe the wound was worse than it was. She had learned to hold her expression steady through injuries that would have made lesser healers turn away. She held it steady now, though this was a different kind of wound entirely. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman she vaguely recognized as one of the kitchen staff turned to her friend and murmured something about how lucky the healer must feel, standing so close to witness such a historic night. Alira did not correct her. She simply watched Cale's face across the hall, waiting for him to look toward the eastern pillar, the way he always did, in crowded rooms. Some habit of 3 years that told her he still knew exactly where she stood, even when he was speaking to everyone else. He did not look. He was looking at Seraphine, and at her father, and at the assembled nobles who represented the fragile peace his kingdom needed to survive the coming winter. He was doing what a king does. Alira understood that, even as something inside her chest folded quietly in on itself, the way paper folds when it is meant to be thrown into a fire. She thought of 2 nights ago, the map spread across his desk, the candlelight low, his thumb tracing slow circles against the back of her hand while he spoke about the future as though it belonged to both of them. He had told her about a cottage near the northern border, one his mother had loved, and how he thought it might make a fine place for a family someday, somewhere quiet, away from the constant noise of court. He had not said her name attached to that future. She realized now, standing in the hall with her palm pressed to cold stone, that he had never actually said her name attached to any of it. She had simply assumed, because assuming had been easier than asking. and asking had felt like it might break something too fragile to survive the question. She had been wrong to assume. She understood that now, with a clarity that felt like ice water down her spine. The chanting in the hall grew louder. Someone called for wine to be brought for a formal toast, and the crowd began to shift and reorganize itself into the kind of loose, celebratory chaos that followed any major announcement. Elira used the movement as cover. She slipped along the pillar, past a cluster of nobles, debating the details of the alliance, past 2 young wolves from the border guard, who barely spared her a glance, and out through the side entrance that led toward the healer's wing. No one stopped her. No one noticed her leave at all. That, more than anything else that night, was the detail that stayed with her. She walked the long stone corridor toward her chambers with her spine straight and her steps even, because even now, even with her whole chest hollowed out, some part of her refused to let the castle see her break. She passed a guard posted near the archive doors, a young man named Corin who had once come to her with a broken wrist and never forgotten the kindness she'd shown him during the healing. He nodded to her in greeting. She nodded back. Her voice, when she spoke a simple good night to him, did not shake at all, and she was almost proud of that, in the distant, disconnected way a person can be proud of something while feeling nothing else. Her chambers were small compared to the rest of the castle, tucked into the healer's wing, where the scent of dried herbs and clean linen always lingered in the air. She had lived here for 3 years. She had healed wolves in this room who would have died without her hands, had spent countless nights bent over recipes for salves and tinctures by candlelight, had built a life here stitched together from purpose and quiet competence, and, she had let herself believe, love. She closed the door behind her and did not light the candle. For a long moment, she simply stood in the dark, one hand pressed flat against her own chest, as though she could hold herself together through sheer physical pressure. Her heart was beating too fast. Her throat ached with the effort of not making a single sound. Somewhere beyond the walls of the healer's wing, she could still hear the distant echo of celebration drifting through the castle. Laughter and music carried on the autumn air, and every note of it felt like a small blade. She thought about walking back into that hall. She thought about pushing through the crowd until she stood in front of Kale and Seraphine and every noble in the room, and asking him, plainly, whether the promises he had whispered to her across a desk 2 nights ago had meant anything at all, or whether she had simply been convenient. A comfort between political maneuvers, something to occupy his private hours while he prepared, all along, to give his public future to someone else. She thought about it, and then she let the thought go, because she already knew the answer would not change anything. A king's word to his people carried more weight than a king's word to his healer, whispered in private, unwitnessed. She had known that from the beginning. In some quiet corner of her mind, she had chosen not to listen to. She had let herself hope anyway. Hope, she thought now, standing alone in the dark, was the most expensive thing a person could allow themselves to feel. She lit a single candle at last, because she needed the light to think clearly, and sat down at the small writing desk in the corner of her room. Her hands, when she reached for a sheet of parchment, were steady. That surprised her. She had expected them to shake. She did not write him a letter of accusation. She did not write him a letter demanding an explanation, or begging him to reconsider, or asking him to choose her instead of the alliance his kingdom needed. She had too much pride left for that, even now, even hollowed out as she was. Instead, she wrote a short, formal resignation, addressed to the castle steward, citing personal reasons, and expressing gratitude for the years she had been permitted to serve the pack as healer. She kept her handwriting even. She did not allow a single word of what she felt to bleed into the ink. When she finished, she folded the letter twice and set it on top of her desk where it would be found in the morning. Then she began to pack. She did not take much. A healer learned early to travel light, because emergencies did not wait for careful preparation, and Elira had always kept a bag ready near her door out of old habit, filled with the essentials of her trade. She added to it now, clothing that would serve her well on the road. A small collection of coin she had saved over 3 years of service, never spent, because she had never needed anything the castle did not already provide. Her mother's old pendant, the only thing she had left of a family long gone, which she fastened around her neck beneath her collar, where it would not be seen. She left behind almost everything else. The dried flowers Kale had once brought her after a difficult healing, pressed flat between the pages of an herbal text. The small wooden carving of a wolf he had given her for her birthday, carved by his own hands during a rare quiet evening, which she had kept on her windowsill for a year. She looked at these things for a long moment in the candlelight, memorizing them the way she memorized the details of a wound before treating it, and then she turned away and did not look back. The last thing she did before leaving her chambers was the hardest. Every wolf born into a pack carried a tether, an invisible thread of magic that bound them to their alpha's territory, allowing the pack to sense when one of their own was in danger, allowing the alpha to call his people home in times of great need. Illyra had worn her tether to Kale's pack since the day she arrived, 3 years ago, a frightened healer with nowhere else to go, and he had been the one to offer her a place among his people. Severing a tether was not forbidden, but it was rare, and it was painful, and it required a ritual that most wolves avoided entirely, because the process left the body raw for days afterward. Illyra had performed the ritual for others exactly twice in her years as healer. She had never imagined performing it on herself. She knelt in the center of her small chamber, drew a simple circle in chalk around herself the way the old texts instructed, and began the low chant that would unravel the thread connecting her to this place, to this pack, to him. The pain came fast and sharp, a burning that started somewhere behind her sternum and spread outward through her chest like fire finding dry wood, and she bit down hard against the sound that wanted to climb out of her throat. She would not let anyone hear her. She would not let this castle have one more piece of her grief. By the time the ritual finished, the candle had burned low, and Illyra knelt in the center of the chalk circle with tears finally sliding silently down her face, the first she had allowed herself all night. The tether was gone. She could feel its absence the way a person feels the absence of a missing tooth, a strange hollow space where something had been for so long it had felt permanent. She was free of him now, in the way magic could make a person free. Her heart, she knew, would take considerably longer. She rose, wiped her face, and shouldered her bag. The castle at that hour was quiet, in the way old stone buildings became quiet after celebration. The noise of the hall long since dissolved into scattered laughter, and the occasional distant footstep of a servant clearing dishes. Illyra moved through the corridors she knew better than any other place in the world, past the kitchens where the ovens still held the last of their warmth, past the training yard where she had stitched more wounds than she could count, past the garden where she had first met Kale 3 years ago, a stranger offering shelter to a healer fleeing a war she never spoke about. She did not let herself think about that meeting now. There would be time for memory later, on the road, when the walls of this place were far behind her, and she had nothing left to do but sit with everything she had lost. The stable yard was empty at this hour, and Illyra moved among the horses with the quiet confidence of someone who had cared for them during long nights when a healer's other duties kept her awake anyway. She chose a sturdy gray mare that had always favored her, saddled it herself without waking the stable hands, and led it out through the smaller side gate that the healers used when called to emergencies beyond the castle walls. The guard posted there recognized her uniform and waved her through without question, assuming, as everyone always assumed, that a healer traveling in the dead of night was simply answering a call for help somewhere beyond the walls. In a way, she thought as she rode out into the cold autumn dark, that was exactly true. She was answering a call. It simply was not the kind anyone in that castle would understand. The road away from Ashgrove territory wound through dense forest before opening onto the wider trade paths that connected the northern territories to the human-adjacent border towns beyond. Illyra had traveled this road exactly once before, 3 years ago, arriving rather than leaving, and the strange symmetry of it struck her as she rode, the sense that her life had folded back on itself, delivering her to the same crossroads with an entirely different heart inside her chest. She did not cry again. She had used her tears in the privacy of her chamber, spent them on the chalk circle and the pain of severing her tether, and now, riding alone beneath a sky full of indifferent stars, she found she had nothing left but a strange, hollow calm. It was not peace. She was not foolish enough to mistake it for peace. But it was steady, and steady was enough to keep her moving forward, 1 mile at a time, away from a kingdom that had never truly been hers to claim. Behind her, the castle grew smaller against the horizon, its lights flickering like distant candles, still burning with the last of the celebration she had left behind. Somewhere in that castle, she knew, Kale was likely still standing beside Seraphine, accepting the congratulations of nobles and allies, entirely unaware that the woman who had healed his wounds for 3 years, who had believed, foolishly, in a future he had never truly promised her, was riding away from everything she had built at his side. He would not notice her absence tonight. She understood that now with a clarity that no longer hurt quite as sharply as it had an hour ago. Kings rarely noticed the quiet ones until the quiet ones were gone. By the time dawn broke gray and cold over the eastern hills, Elira Voss had crossed the boundary stone that marked the edge of Ashgrove territory, and she did not look back at what she was leaving behind. Ahead of her lay an uncertain road, a new name she had not yet chosen, and a life she would have to build entirely on her own terms, without a crown, without a king, without the promises that had turned out to weigh less than she had once believed. She urged the mare into a steady walk and rode on into the pale morning light, alone, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely her own. The steward found the letter on Elira's desk 2 mornings later, and by the time word of it reached the upper halls, the healer's chambers had already gone cold. Garrick Wells, the castle steward, was not a man given to panic. He had served 3 alphas in his lifetime, and had learned, through long years of careful service, to keep his composure through fires, border skirmishes, and at least one attempted uprising within the pack itself. But when he unfolded the single sheet of parchment left on Elira Voss's desk, and read the short, formal lines of her resignation, something in his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with duty. He had known her for 3 years. He had watched her arrive as a frightened stranger with nothing but a healer's bag and a past she never discussed, and he had watched her become something the entire pack depended on, quietly and without ever asking for recognition. He had also watched the way the Alpha King's eyes softened whenever she entered a room, a detail Garrick had never spoken aloud to anyone, because it was not his place, and because some things were better left unspoken until the people involved chose to speak them themselves. Apparently, they never had. Garrick carried the letter to Cale's private study himself, rather than sending it through the usual channels, because instinct told him this was not news that should pass through the hands of servants and messengers before it reached the king. He found Cale standing at the tall window that overlooked the training yard, still dressed in the formal black and silver from 2 nights before, though the fine fabric now looked slept in, wrinkled from a night that had clearly not been spent resting. Seraphine's father had left that morning with his formal escort, the alliance sealed, the celebrations concluded, and the castle had settled into the particular quiet that always followed a large gathering, servants sweeping the great hall, kitchens working through the last of the feast preparations, the ordinary rhythm of court returning to its usual pace. "My king," Garrick said, and something in his voice must have carried more weight than usual, because Cale turned from the window immediately, his expression sharpening. "What is it?" Garrick held out the letter without further explanation, because he did not know how to soften what it contained, and watched Cale's face as he read it. He would remember, for a long time afterward, the exact moment the color left the Alpha King's face. Cale read the letter twice. Garrick could see his eyes move across the same lines a second time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less final if he simply looked hard enough. When he finally lowered the parchment, his hand was not entirely steady, a detail Garrick had never once witnessed in 3 years of service to a man renowned for his composure under pressure. "When was this found?" Cale said, and his voice had gone very quiet. "This morning, my king. On her desk. Her chambers are empty. It appears she left 2 nights ago, the night of the gathering." Cale's jaw tightened. 2 nights ago. "Yes, my king." For a long moment, Cale said nothing at all. He stood very still, the letter clenched in one hand, and Garrick watched something move behind his eyes that looked almost like the process of a man reconstructing an entire night from a new and terrible angle, replaying every moment of the gathering, with the sudden, sick understanding that he had missed something enormous happening directly in front of him. "Find her," Cale said finally. "My king, we don't know which direction she—" "Find her," Cale repeated, and this time, the command carried the particular weight of an alpha's voice, the kind that made every wolf within earshot feel the pull of instinctive obedience, even Garrick, who had built decades of resistance to that pull through long service, at close proximity to power. "Send riders. Check the border gates. Someone saw her leave. Someone always sees." Garrick bowed and left to carry out the order, though privately, He suspected the search would prove more difficult than his king currently believed. A healer who had spent 3 years learning the quiet art of moving unseen through a busy castle, tending emergencies at all hours, slipping in and out of chambers without waking the household, was exactly the kind of person who knew precisely how to disappear when she chose to. Cale remained alone in his study for a long time after Garrick left, the letter still clenched in his hand, and slowly, methodically, he made himself walk through the events of the gathering night in a way he had not allowed himself to do since it happened. He remembered stepping onto the dais. He remembered the weight of the announcement he had rehearsed for weeks, the careful political language his advisors had helped him craft, the necessary alliance that would secure peace between his territory and Duskmoor's for the first time in a generation. He remembered Seraphine's hand in his, cool and steady, and the roar of approval from the crowd that had followed. He remembered, too, in a way he had not let himself examine closely until this exact moment, a fraction of a second, where his gaze had swept the hall out of pure habit, searching automatically for a particular pillar near the eastern wall, the place Illyra always stood during formal gatherings. He remembered not finding her there. He remembered assuming, in the chaos of the moment, that she had simply chosen a different spot in the crowded hall, and pushing the thought aside because the ceremony demanded his full attention. He had not looked for her again. He had not looked for her at all, in fact, until 2 days had passed and her absence from his private study, where she often came in the evenings under the excuse of discussing herb supplies, but where they both understood something far less official was actually happening, had finally registered as strange rather than simply busy. He had told himself she was occupied with the aftermath of the gathering, tending to minor injuries among the celebrating crowd, catching up on rest after long hours of preparation. He had told himself a great many things over those 2 days, each one a small, convenient lie that had allowed him to avoid the obvious truth, sitting directly in front of him. She had not come to him because she had already left. Cale set the letter down on his desk with careful precision, as though handling it roughly might somehow make its contents worse than they already were, and pressed both hands flat against the wood, bracing himself. He thought, unwillingly, of a conversation 2 nights before the gathering, the two of them alone in this very study with maps spread across the desk between them, discussing the northern border treaties late into the evening. He remembered reaching for her hand without entirely meaning to, the way he often did when they were alone together, a habit neither of them had ever named aloud. He remembered telling her about the cottage near the northern border, his mother's old retreat, and how he had pictured, in the vague and hopeful way a man pictures a future he has not yet earned, a quiet life there someday, away from the endless demands of court. He had not told her that Seraphine Duskmoor's name had already been discussed among his advisors for months. He had not told her that the alliance had been all but decided before that quiet evening ever took place, that the announcement at the gathering was less a choice made in that moment, and more the final formal step in a political arrangement set into motion long before. He had told himself, in the private, self-serving way people tell themselves things they do not wish to examine too closely, that there would be time to explain everything to her before the gathering, that she deserved to hear it from him directly, rather than learn it alongside the rest of the kingdom. He had run out of time. Or, more honestly, he had let the days slip past without making time, because the conversation felt impossible to have, and because some cowardly part of him had hoped, absurdly, that everything might simply work itself out, without him having to say the difficult things aloud. It had not worked itself out. It had ended, instead, with a formal resignation letter on an empty desk in an empty room. Cale pushed away from his desk and left the study before the weight of his own thoughts could settle any further, moving through the castle corridors with the restless energy of a man who needed motion more than he needed direction. He found himself, without entirely deciding to, standing outside Illyra's empty chambers in the healer's wing, the door left slightly ajar from the search parties, who had already come through that morning looking for any clue to her destination. He stepped inside. The room was smaller than his own chambers by a significant margin, simple and practical in the way everything about Illyra had always been simple and practical, and yet it had never once felt sparse to him during the countless evenings he had spent here, discussing herb inventories that somehow always turned into longer conversations neither of them wanted to end. He saw the small wooden carving of a wolf still sitting on the windowsill, the one he had carved himself during a rare quiet evening a year ago. and something in his chest tightened painfully at the sight of it left behind. He saw the pressed flowers still tucked into the pages of an open herbal text on her small shelf, flowers he had brought her after a difficult healing that had nearly cost her patient's life, a small gesture of comfort she had apparently kept and treasured in a way he had never fully understood until this exact moment, seeing it here, abandoned along with everything else she had chosen to leave behind. She had taken almost nothing with her. That detail struck him harder than anything else in the room. A woman who had built a life here for 3 years had walked away from nearly all of it without a second thought, taking only what she absolutely needed and leaving behind every small token of affection he had ever given her, as though those tokens no longer meant what they once had, or as though carrying them forward would have been too painful to bear. Cale sat down slowly on the edge of her narrow bed, the wooden carving now cradled in his hands, and allowed himself, for the first time since reading her letter, to feel the full weight of what he had done. He had not chosen Alira publicly. He had let her stand in a crowded hall and watch him present another woman as his future, without ever once warning her, without ever once considering how that moment might feel from where she stood. He had told himself, throughout the long process of arranging the alliance, that duty required difficult sacrifices, that a king could not always choose his own heart over the needs of his people, and he had believed, in some quiet, cowardly corner of his mind, that Alira would understand this, that she would remain steady and patient, the way she always remained steady and patient, through everything, waiting for him to eventually find a way to make things right. He understood now, sitting alone in her empty room with her wolf carving in his hands, exactly how much he had asked of her without ever once asking whether she was willing to give it. Outside, he could hear the distant sound of riders preparing to leave the castle grounds, dispatched at his order to search the surrounding territories for any sign of her passage. He knew, even as he listened to the sound of hooves against stone, that finding her would not be simple. Alira had spent 3 years learning the quiet, careful movements of a healer, accustomed to slipping through a busy household unnoticed, and she had clearly applied every bit of that skill toward disappearing completely. He thought of the border gate guard who had reported, hours earlier, a healer riding out through the smaller side gate sometime after midnight on the night of the gathering, assumed at the time to be answering an emergency call beyond the walls. No one had questioned it, no one had thought to stop her, because stopping a healer on an urgent errand would have been unthinkable, and because no one in the castle had yet understood that she was not answering a call for help but escaping one. Cale closed his eyes and pressed the wooden carving against his forehead, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the Alpha King allowed himself to simply sit with the full, uncomfortable truth of his own failure, without the shield of duty or politics or kingdom to soften its edges. He had lost her, not through any single dramatic betrayal, but through countless small silences, through months of assuming she would remain steady no matter what he asked of her, through a failure to ever once say, clearly and directly, the things that mattered most. And now she was somewhere beyond his borders, alone, having severed whatever tether once bound her to this place, and he had no way of knowing whether she intended to ever be found. He rose from the bed eventually, because sitting in her empty room accomplished nothing, and because a kingdom still required its king, even in the aftermath of his own personal ruin. He carried the wooden wolf carving with him when he left, tucking it carefully into his coat, unable to leave it behind the way she apparently had. In the corridor outside, Garrick was waiting, his expression careful and neutral in the particular way of a steward, delivering news he suspected his king did not want to hear. "The riders have returned from the northern road, my king. No sign of her along that route. The eastern road. Nothing yet. They're continuing the search." Cale nodded once, his jaw tight, and turned to walk deeper into the castle, already calculating which direction she was most likely to have taken, already planning the next order he would give, to widen the search beyond his own territory's borders if necessary. He did not yet fully understand, in that first raw day of her absence, that finding Alira would require far more than simply sending riders down every road that led away from his kingdom. He did not yet understand that some things, once broken by silence, could not be repaired by search parties, or urgent riders, or even the full authority of an Alpha King's command. He would understand it eventually, but that understanding would take considerably longer to arrive than the search itself, and by the time it did, Alira Voss would already be building a life entirely beyond his reach, in a small border town where no one called her healer to the king, where no one knew her name had ever been connected to a crown at all. By the end of the first week, Cale Ashgrove had sent riders down every major road within 100 miles of the castle, and every single one of them had returned with nothing. He stood in the war room where his advisors usually gathered to discuss border disputes and territory treaties. But tonight, the maps spread across the long table charted something else entirely, a growing web of routes and crossroads marked with small pins, showing where each search party had traveled, and found no trace of a healer riding alone. She could have changed her appearance, said Bren, the captain of his guard, a broad-shouldered wolf who had served Cale since before either of them had earned their current ranks. Cut her hair, changed her clothes, taken a false name. A healer with her training could pass as almost anyone if she wanted to remain hidden. She would have needed coin, Cale said, pacing the length of the table with his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Enough to travel and settle somewhere new, without needing immediate work. She saved her wages, Garrick offered quietly from near the door. 3 years of a healer's stipend, spent on almost nothing. It would be enough. Cale stopped pacing and stared down at the map, at the pins marking failure after failure, and felt something in his chest tighten with a frustration that had nowhere useful to go. He was accustomed to solving problems through the sheer application of will and resources, to bending circumstances until they yielded the outcome he required. This problem refused to yield. Elira had vanished as thoroughly as if she had never existed at all, and every day that passed without a single credible sighting of her made the possibility of finding her feel more distant. Widen the search, Cale said finally, beyond our borders. The human-adjacent towns along the eastern trade routes. She trained partly in human medicine before she came to us, didn't she? She would know how to blend into a town like that. Bren exchanged a glance with Garrick, the kind of look shared between two people who both understood something their king was not yet ready to hear. My king, Bren said carefully, if she wanted to be found, she would not have severed her tether. The words landed in the room with the particular weight of an unwelcome truth. Cale's head lifted sharply. You felt it too, then? The whole pack felt it, Bren said. The night she left, it woke half the healer's wing. The sudden break in a tether that strong. She didn't do it carelessly, my king. She knew exactly what that ritual would cost her, and she chose to pay it rather than remain connected to this territory in any way at all. Cale said nothing for a long moment, his jaw working, and then he turned away from the map entirely and walked to the tall window at the end of the war room, staring out at the darkened training yard below without truly seeing it. He had felt the tether break himself, though he had not understood at the time what the strange, hollow ache in his chest that night actually meant. He had attributed it to exhaustion, to the stress of the alliance announcement, to the long day of formal ceremony that had left him drained in ways he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. It was only days later, once he understood what she had done, that he recognized the sensation for what it truly was, the severing of a bond that had connected her to his territory, and by extension, to him, for 3 years. She had wanted to be entirely free of him. Not just physically distant, but magically, fundamentally disconnected, in a way that required real pain to achieve. The thought sat in his chest like a stone. Continue the search regardless, Cale said finally, without turning from the window. I don't care how difficult it becomes. I want every eastern trade town checked, every border crossing questioned. If she's out there, someone has seen her. The war room emptied slowly around him as his advisors filed out to relay his orders, until only Garrick remained near the door, watching his king with the quiet patience of a man who had served long enough to recognize grief when it wore the mask of determination. My king, Garrick said carefully, once the room was empty, may I speak plainly? Cale did not turn from the window, but he nodded once. The kingdom is asking questions. The Duskmoor Alliance was announced publicly, and now the Lady Seraphine notices your attention is elsewhere. She has said nothing to embarrass either house, but she is not foolish, and she is not blind. If this continues much longer, the political consequences will extend beyond a search for a missing healer. Cale's shoulders tightened. What would you have me do, Garrick? Abandon the search. I would have you decide, clearly, what it is you actually want, before more people are hurt by the uncertainty. Lady Seraphine deserves honesty as much as Elira did, perhaps more so, since she entered this alliance in good faith, believing your heart was fully available to give. The words struck harder than Garrick likely intended, and Cale turned from the window at last, his expression unreadable in the dim candlelight of the war room. "I know what I want," he said quietly. "I have known for longer than I care to admit. I simply failed to act on it when it mattered most, and now I'm left trying to repair a mistake I should never have made in the first place." "Then perhaps," Garrick said gently, "the first repair should not be a search party. Perhaps it should be a conversation with the woman standing in your own castle, who deserves to know the truth of where your heart actually lies before this goes any further." Cale considered this for a long moment, and then nodded slowly, the decision settling over him with the particular heaviness of something he had been avoiding for far too long. He found Seraphine the following morning in the castle gardens, seated on a stone bench beneath the last of the autumn roses, a book open in her lap that she did not appear to actually be reading. She looked up as he approached, and something in her expression told him she had already guessed, at least in part, what he had come to say. "You've been distracted," she said, before he could speak, closing the book and setting it aside. "Since the gathering. I assumed it was the pressure of the announcement, but it has only grown worse, not better." "Seraphine." "Don't," she said, not unkindly, holding up a hand. "Let me say what I've already worked out for myself, and then you can confirm or deny it as you see fit." Cale fell silent, and Seraphine studied him for a long moment with the sharp, unflinching gaze of a woman who had been raised among political maneuvering her entire life, and had learned early how to read the true intentions beneath a person's careful words. "There was someone else," she said, "before me, someone you cared for deeply, and did not fully let go of when our alliance was arranged. And now that person is gone, and you are tearing this kingdom apart trying to find her, while I sit here, wondering exactly what role I am meant to play, in a heart that clearly already belongs to someone else." Cale sat down heavily on the bench beside her, unable to meet her eyes for a long moment. "I never meant to hurt you, Seraphine. The alliance between our territories is real and important, and I do not regret the peace it will bring our people. But you deserve someone whose heart is entirely available to you, and I cannot honestly say that mine is." "The healer," Seraphine said quietly. It was not a question. Cale nodded once, unable to find words adequate to the admission. Seraphine was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the roses in front of them, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried a surprising steadiness that Cale had not expected. "I will not pretend this doesn't wound my pride," she said. "I came into this arrangement prepared to build something real between us, in time, the way most alliance marriages eventually manage to build something real. I did not come here to be anyone's second choice, quietly tolerated, while your heart remained elsewhere. You wouldn't have been. I would have been exactly that," Seraphine said, cutting him off gently, but firmly, whether either of us admitted it aloud or not. "And I have watched my own mother live that exact life. Cale, married to a man whose heart belonged permanently to someone else, and I promised myself long ago that I would never accept the same fate for myself, regardless of what political advantage it might bring my father's territory." Cale studied her carefully, seeing, perhaps for the first time, the full measure of the woman sitting beside him, rather than simply the political arrangement she represented. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," Seraphine replied, rising from the bench with the same quiet confidence she had carried into the great hall on the night of the gathering, "that I release you from any obligation you feel toward our arrangement. My father will be furious, and the political consequences will need to be managed carefully to avoid damaging the peace between our territories. But I will not spend the rest of my life as a placeholder for a woman you clearly still love, and I suspect, if you are honest with yourself, that pursuing this alliance any further would only bring us both a lifetime of quiet unhappiness." Cale rose as well, studying her with something that felt uncomfortably close to gratitude mixed with guilt. "You deserve far better than the way I've handled this, Seraphine. I am sorry." "I know," she said simply, and for a moment, something almost like sympathy passed across her features. "Find her, Cale, and when you do, make certain you tell her the truth this time, rather than letting your duty speak for you, while your heart stays silent. She deserves that much, at the very least, after everything you apparently put her through without ever once explaining yourself." She left him alone in the garden then, walking back toward the castle with her spine straight and her chin lifted, carrying herself with the same dignity she had carried into every room since her arrival, and Cale watched her go with a strange mixture of relief and renewed urgency settling into his chest. The path forward, at least regarding Seraphine, had cleared itself with far more grace than he deserved, but the larger problem remained entirely unresolved, and it grew more urgent with every day that passed. Illyra was still out there somewhere, beyond his borders, likely under a false name, likely believing that nothing waited for her back in this kingdom, except the memory of a king who had let her stand silently in a crowded hall, while he presented her future to another woman. He needed to find her. Not simply to explain himself, though the explanation was long overdue. He needed to find her, because the thought of a lifetime without her, stretched out ahead of him in the quiet, empty hours of a throne room that suddenly felt far too large for one man alone, had become entirely unbearable to consider. He returned to the war room that evening with renewed determination, calling for Bren and Garrick and every advisor with knowledge of the eastern trade routes, and began, methodically and relentlessly, to plan a search that would not stop until it found her, regardless of how long it took or how many borders it required crossing. Somewhere beyond his territory, in a town he had not yet identified, Illyra Voss was building a life without him, believing, as far as he knew, that she had been nothing more than a convenient comfort to a king who had never truly intended to choose her. He intended to prove her wrong, whatever it cost him, and however long it took to accomplish. The search, he decided that night, would not end until he found her. The town of Millbrook sat at the edge of the eastern trade routes, close enough to the human world that shifters who settled there learned quickly to keep their nature quiet, and far enough from any territory's borders that no pack considered it worth the trouble of claiming. It was exactly the kind of place a person went when they wanted to disappear, without disappearing entirely. A town of quiet strangers, who had each, in their own way, left something behind, and chosen not to speak of it. Illyra arrived there 3 weeks after leaving Ashgrove Castle, her coin nearly spent, her body still recovering from the long ache of a severed tether that had made every mile of travel feel heavier than it should have. She took a room above a small apothecary near the edge of town, paid for it with the last of her savings, and told the elderly woman who owned the shop that her name was Lyra Vance, a healer looking for quiet work, nothing more. The woman, whose name was Marin Holt, studied her for a long moment with the particular sharpness of someone who had spent decades reading people who walked through her door, carrying more than they said aloud, and then simply nodded and handed her a key. "Room's small," Marin said, "but it's warm, and it's yours as long as you need it. I could use another set of hands around the shop, if you're willing to work for your keep while you find your footing." Illyra had accepted, grateful beyond words for a kindness that asks no questions, and within a month, she had settled into the rhythm of a life that felt, in its own strange way, more honest than anything she had built at Ashgrove Castle. The work suited her. Marin's apothecary served the entire town, human and shifter alike, and Illyra's training as a healer proved more valuable than either of them had initially expected. She set broken bones for farmers who had fallen from ladders. She treated fevers in children too young to understand why the medicine tasted bitter. She learned, slowly, the particular satisfaction of healing people who knew nothing about crowns or alliances or the quiet politics of packed territories, people who simply needed help and were grateful, plainly and without complication, when she provided it. Marin became something close to family within the first few months, a sharp-tongued but deeply kind woman who never once pushed Illyra to explain the past she so clearly carried, but who also never let her disappear entirely into her own grief. She had a habit of appearing in the doorway of Illyra's small room on the evenings when the silence stretched too long, carrying tea and gossip about the town in equal measure, refusing to let her newest boarder retreat too far into isolation. "You've got that look again," Marin said one evening, several months into Illyra's stay, settling into the worn chair beside the small window with 2 cups of chamomile tea balanced carefully in her weathered hands. "The one where you're somewhere else entirely, even though your body's sitting right here in my chair." Illyra accepted the tea without meeting her eyes, staring instead at the steam curling upward from the cup. "I'm fine, Marin." "You're not," Marin said, not unkindly, "but you don't have to tell me why, if you're not ready." I've buried 2 husbands and outlived most of my friends in this town, girl. I know grief when I see it sitting in someone's shoulders, whatever shape it happens to take." Alira said nothing for a long moment, and then, slowly, in pieces that felt like pulling stitches from a half-healed wound, she began to speak. She did not tell Maren everything, not the details of crowns or territories or the exact nature of the man she had left behind, but she told her enough. A love she had believed in completely. A public announcement that had shattered that belief in front of an entire crowd. A silence she had chosen, rather than the humiliation of demanding an explanation she suspected would only confirm what she already feared. Maren listened without interrupting, her weathered hands wrapped around her own cup of tea, and when Alira finally fell silent, she simply reached over and patted her hand once, gently. "He sounds like a man who mistook your patience for permission," Maren said. "That's a common mistake among people who've never had to fight for anything they wanted. They assume the quiet ones will simply wait forever, because waiting is what they've always done. It takes losing someone entirely for men like that to understand what patience actually costs the person offering it." The words settled into Alira's chest with an uncomfortable precision, and she found herself, for the first time since leaving Ashgrove Castle, actually considering the shape of what had happened to her, rather than simply enduring the pain of it. She had waited. She had waited quietly, patiently, believing that her steadiness would eventually be rewarded with the future she had allowed herself to imagine. She had never once demanded clarity, never once asked directly what she meant to him, because asking had felt like risking the fragile thing they had built in private, and she had preferred the uncertainty of hope to the finality of a direct answer that might have disappointed her. She understood now, sitting in Maren's small room with tea cooling in her hands, that her silence had cost her as much as his had. Over the following weeks, Alira began to notice a shift in herself that she had not expected. The work at the apothecary, simple and repetitive as it often was, gave her days a structure that grief alone could never have provided. She began joining a small group of women from the town who gathered once a week to share a meal and trade stories, most of them entirely unaware of her past, treating her simply as Lyra, the healer who had settled quietly into their community and proven herself useful and kind. Among them was a young widow named Fenella, who had lost her mate to a hunting accident 2 years prior, and a rogue shifter named Torin, who had left his birth pack under circumstances he never fully explained, but who had built a quiet life as Millbrook's blacksmith, his enormous hands surprisingly gentle whenever he helped Alira carry heavy supplies into the apothecary. They asked no questions about her past, and in exchange, she asked none about theirs. It was an unspoken agreement among the town's collection of quiet outcasts, an understanding that everyone arriving in Millbrook carried something they preferred not to discuss, and that the kindest thing anyone could offer a newcomer was simply the freedom to exist without explanation. Alira found herself healing in ways that had nothing to do with her formal training. The ache of her severed tether faded slowly over the following months, though she still felt its absence some nights, a strange phantom sensation where a connection had once existed. The grief over Kale did not disappear entirely, but it began, gradually, to lose its sharpest edges, transforming from a wound that consumed her every waking thought into something quieter, a scar she carried, rather than an open injury that bled with every movement. She began, for the first time in her adult life, to consider what she actually wanted for herself, separate from any role she had played in someone else's story. She had spent 3 years at Ashgrove Castle defining herself entirely through her usefulness to others, first as a healer serving the pack, and later, in private, as the quiet comfort of a king who never publicly acknowledged what she meant to him. In Millbrook, surrounded by people who valued her simply for the person she was, rather than any role she filled, she began to rediscover pieces of herself that had gone quiet during her years at the castle, pieces that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations or needs. She started keeping a small garden behind the apothecary, growing herbs, not because Maren's shop required them, but because she found genuine peace in the slow, patient work of tending something that asked nothing of her except care and attention. She began reading again for pleasure rather than professional necessity, borrowing books from the town's small collection, and losing entire evenings to stories that had nothing to do with healing or politics or kingdoms at all. She learned, slowly, to laugh again, without the laughter catching painfully in her throat, to enjoy an evening meal with Fenella and Torin, without the shadow of Ashgrove Castle darkening every moment of the conversation. It was not that she forgot Cale entirely. Some nights, lying awake in her small room above the apothecary, she still found herself remembering the particular warmth of his hand covering hers, across a desk covered in maps, the low, vermavert laughter they had shared during quiet evenings that had felt, at the time, like the beginning of a future, rather than the end of one. She still wondered, sometimes, whether he had searched for her at all, or whether her absence had simply resolved itself neatly into his political life, leaving room for the alliance he had chosen to prioritize over whatever they had built together in private. But the wondering no longer consumed her the way it once had. She had built something real in Millbrook, something that belonged entirely to her, unattached to any crown or castle or man who had once made her believe in a future he had never truly promised. She had a home. She had friends who valued her honestly. She had work that mattered, and a garden that grew slowly under her patient care, and a name, even a borrowed one, that she wore comfortably as her own. Nearly a year passed this way, the seasons turning slowly over Millbrook, the town's quiet rhythms becoming as familiar to Alira as the halls of Ashgrove Castle had once been. She healed the sick and set broken bones and tended her small garden and shared meals with friends who asked no questions, and slowly, carefully, she began to believe that she might actually be healing from more than just the severed tether that had once connected her to a kingdom she had left behind. She did not know, on the quiet autumn evening, nearly a year after her arrival, tending her herb garden in the fading light with dirt beneath her fingernails and something close to genuine contentment settling in her chest, that a rider was approaching the edge of Millbrook from the western road. Having spent nearly a year methodically searching every trade town within reach of Ashgrove's borders, refusing to abandon a search that had cost him considerably more than he had ever imagined it would when he first sent his riders out into the autumn night, so many months ago now, chasing the memory of a woman who had left without a single word of farewell. The search had cost Cale Ashgrove far more than he had anticipated when he first ordered his riders out into the night nearly a year earlier, and by the time autumn returned to his territory, the toll had become visible to everyone in his kingdom. He had aged in ways that had nothing to do with the passage of time itself. The advisors who had once found him quick to laugh during council meetings now watched him move through the business of governing with the careful, mechanical precision of a man performing duty rather than living it. He handled every treaty, every border dispute, every request from his people with the same thoroughness he had always brought to his role as Alpha King, but something essential seemed to have gone quiet in him. A warmth that had once made his leadership feel personal rather than simply competent. Bren noticed it first, in the training yard, where Cale had once sparred alongside his warriors with genuine enjoyment, and now moved through the exercises with a grim, joyless efficiency that unsettled everyone who trained alongside him. Garrick noticed it in the small daily interactions of running the castle, the way Cale no longer lingered in conversation the way he once had, no longer asked after the well-being of his staff with the easy warmth that had once made him beloved among the people who served him. Even the kitchen staff noticed it, in the way meals returned to the kitchen barely touched, in the way candlelight burned late in the study window, long after the rest of the castle had gone quiet for the night. The search itself had expanded far beyond the initial riders sent out in the days following Alira's disappearance. Cale had eventually engaged trackers skilled in following cold trails, had sent quiet inquiries through trade networks that stretched across territories he had no formal alliance with, had spent considerable resources chasing rumors of a healer, matching her description, in towns scattered across 3 different regions, each lead eventually dissolving into nothing. Twice, the search had come agonizingly close. A tracker had found evidence of a healer answering to an unfamiliar name in a border town 6 months into the search, only to discover, upon further investigation, that the woman in question was considerably older than Alira and had lived in the town for over a decade. Another lead, 4 months later, had traced a healer's movements through a series of small villages along the eastern trade route, following a trail that grew warmer with each town, until it simply vanished, entirely at a crossroads, where the trail split 3 ways, and no further witnesses could be found. Cale had begun to wonder, during the darkest stretches of the search, whether he was chasing something that no longer existed. Perhaps Alira had changed her name so completely, had buried her old life so thoroughly, that no trail remained for even the most skilled tracker to follow. Perhaps she had left the continent's populated regions entirely, choosing isolation over the risk of ever being found by someone connected to the kingdom she had fled. It was Garrick, ultimately, who brought him the lead that finally proved credible. A merchant returning from the eastern trade routes, Garrick said, entering the war room, where Cale had taken to spending most of his evenings, poring over maps that had become almost worn through from months of constant handling. He mentioned, in passing, a healer working in a small town called Millbrook. Details match closely enough to warrant investigation. Dark hair, quiet manner, exceptional skill with wounds that most healers in that region wouldn't know how to treat properly. The merchant said the townspeople speak highly of her, though she keeps mostly to herself outside of her work. Cale's head lifted sharply from the map in front of him. Millbrook. I don't recognize the name. It's small, Garrick said. Barely more than a trading post, situated at the edge of the eastern routes where several human-adjacent settlements converge. Not the kind of place that draws much attention, which may be precisely why it took this long to surface as a possibility. How long ago did the merchant see her? Within the last month, my king. If she's still there, the trail is fresh. Cale was on his feet before Garrick finished speaking, already calling for his traveling cloak, already calculating the fastest route to a town he had never heard of before this exact conversation, carrying a hope he had not allowed himself to feel this strongly in months. I'm riding out myself, Cale said. Tonight. My king. Surely a party of trackers would be more efficient, better equipped too. I'm riding out myself, Cale repeated, and something in his voice closed the conversation entirely. He had sent countless riders and trackers over the past year, had directed the search from the safety and distance of his own castle, and every single lead had eventually dissolved into nothing. He understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that if this lead proved genuine, he needed to be the one who found her, needed to look her in the eyes himself, rather than sending another stranger to deliver news of a search she had likely spent the entire year hoping would never succeed. He rode out that night with only Bren accompanying him, both men pushing their horses hard through the darkness, following the eastern trade route toward a small town that represented, after nearly a year of searching, the first, genuinely credible hope Cale had felt since the morning he first read Alira's resignation letter. The journey took the better part of 4 days, the two men stopping only when their horses required rest, sleeping in short, restless intervals beside the road, before continuing on before dawn each morning. Cale said little during the ride, his mind consumed with the enormity of what he intended to say to Alira if the lead proved true, rehearsing and discarding 100 different explanations, none of which felt adequate to the year of silence and searching that had passed between the night she left and whatever conversation might finally await him in Millbrook. He thought, during the long hours of riding, about everything Garrick had said to him in the garden nearly a year ago, about the difference between choosing someone through action rather than simply feeling something for them privately, while allowing duty and circumstance to dictate his public choices instead. He understood now, with the clarity that only a year of consequences could provide, exactly how thoroughly he had failed her through his silence, through his assumption that quiet devotion required no active choice, no public acknowledgement, no risk on his part at all. He had asked everything of her patience, and offered nothing of his own courage in return. That understanding sat in his chest throughout the long ride, heavier with every mile that brought him closer to whatever awaited him in Millbrook. On the 4th evening, as the sun began to sink low over the horizon, Cale and Bren crested a small rise in the road, and saw, spread out in the valley below them, the modest collection of buildings that made up the town of Millbrook, smoke rising from chimneys as the town settled into evening, lanterns beginning to glow in windows scattered across the small settlement. Cale reined in his horse at the top of the rise and simply stared down at the town for a long moment, his heart pounding with a nervous energy he had not felt this intensely in longer than he could remember. We should find lodging first, Bren said carefully, watching his king's face with the wary attention of a man who understood exactly how much rode on the coming hours. Ask discreet questions before announcing ourselves too openly. If she's here, and if she doesn't wish to be found, we don't want to give her cause to disappear again before you've had the chance to speak with her. Cale nodded slowly, forcing himself to accept the wisdom of caution despite every instinct urging him to ride directly into the town and search every building until he found her. You're right. We'll be careful. They rode down into Millbrook as the last light of evening faded from the sky, and Cale Ashgrove found himself, for the first time in nearly a year, allowing himself to hope that the search that had consumed him so completely might finally, after so many false leads and dissolved trails, be drawing to an end. Illyra noticed the two strangers the moment they rode into Millbrook, the way anyone in a small town notices new faces, though she thought little of it beyond the passing observation that travelers occasionally pass through on their way along the eastern trade routes. She was standing in Marin's apothecary, mixing a tincture for a farmer's persistent cough, when Torin appeared in the doorway, with an unusual seriousness in his broad, weathered face. "Lyra," he said, using the name the town had known her by for nearly a year now. "There are two men asking questions at the inn. Asking about a healer, dark hair, quiet manner, exceptional skill with wounds. One of them carries himself like a man used to command." Illyra's hands went still over the mortar and pestle, her heart suddenly beating hard against her ribs. "What did they look like?" she asked, though some deep, instinctive part of her already suspected the answer, before Torin finished describing them. The tall, dark-haired man with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, the broad-shouldered warrior, traveling alongside him. She left the apothecary through the back door, before Torin finished his description, her mind racing through a dozen possible responses, none of which felt adequate to the sudden, overwhelming panic rising in her chest. A year. She had spent a year building this life, this quiet, careful existence, stitched together from patience and honest work, and the slow, gradual healing of a wound she had once believed might never close. She was not ready to have that year unravel in a single conversation with a man who had once let her stand silently in a crowded hall while he chose someone else in front of the entire kingdom. She did not run, though every instinct urged her toward flight. She had run once already, and while it had saved her in the immediate aftermath of her pain, she understood now, standing in the small garden behind the apothecary with her hands trembling slightly at her sides, that running again would only delay an inevitable conversation rather than avoid it entirely. If Cale Ashgrove had found her after a year of searching, he would not simply give up and return home empty-handed. She knew him well enough, even after everything, to understand that much about his character. She spent that night awake in her small room above the apothecary, staring at the ceiling, rehearsing, and discarding 100 different responses to a conversation she had not yet had, uncertain whether she wanted to see him at all, uncertain what she would even say if she did. The knock came the following morning, gentle but unmistakable, and Illyra opened the door to find Cale Ashgrove standing in the narrow hallway outside her room, looking somehow both exactly as she remembered him and entirely changed, the year having carved lines of exhaustion and worry into a face she had once known better than her own. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, simply standing in the doorway, taking in the reality of each other. After a year of separation, neither had fully expected to end this way. "You found me," Illyra said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "It took nearly a year," Cale said quietly. "I searched every town along every trade route I could think to check. I had almost given up hope, more than once, that I would ever find you at all." "Perhaps that should tell you something," Illyra said, and though her voice remained even, there was an edge beneath it that had not existed in her tone a year ago, a hardness earned through months of rebuilding herself from nothing. "I didn't want to be found, Cale. I left deliberately, and I severed my tether deliberately, and I built an entirely new life here, specifically because I did not want the old one to follow me." "I know," Cale said, and something in his voice, a rawness she had rarely heard from him even during their most private conversations at the castle, made her pause. "I know, and I understand why. I have understood, more clearly with every mile of this search, exactly how badly I failed you, Illyra. I'm not here to demand you return with me. I'm here because you deserve an explanation you never received, and because I could not live with myself if I let another year pass without at least trying to give you one." She studied him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his expression against the memory of standing silently in that crowded hall, watching him present another woman's future, without a single glance in her direction. "Then explain." He did not ask to come inside, understanding instinctively that she would decide the terms of this conversation, and instead, they walked together through the quiet morning streets of Millbrook, toward the small garden Elira had built behind the apothecary, a place that felt, to her at least, like neutral ground, rather than territory that belonged to either of their old lives. The alliance with Duskmore was decided months before the gathering, Cale said, once they had settled onto a low stone bench among her carefully tended herbs. My advisors had been negotiating it quietly for the better part of a year, long before that evening in my study, when I spoke to you about the northern cottage, about a future I let myself imagine, without ever telling you the truth of what was already being arranged behind the scenes. You let me believe, Elira said, and her voice finally cracked slightly around the words she had held inside for a year, that we were building something together. You spoke of a future as though it belonged to both of us, and then you stood on that dais and gave that future to someone else, without a single word of warning. I know, Cale said, and he did not try to defend himself against the accusation, understanding, finally, after a year of consequences, that defense was not what this conversation required. I told myself, for months, that there would be time to explain everything before the gathering, that you deserved to hear the truth from me directly, rather than learn it alongside the rest of the kingdom. I kept finding reasons to delay that conversation, because it felt impossible, because I was a coward who wanted to keep both the comfort of what we had built privately and the political security of the alliance my kingdom needed, without ever having to choose openly between them. And when you finally did choose, Elira said quietly, you chose without me, in front of everyone. Yes, Cale said, and the single word carried the full weight of everything he had spent a year understanding about his own failure. I chose duty over honesty, and I asked you, without ever actually asking, to simply accept whatever role I decided to give you, without ever considering how deeply that silence would wound you. I have spent this entire year understanding exactly how much I asked of your patience, while offering none of my own courage in return. Elira was quiet for a long moment, staring out at her garden, at the herbs she had grown slowly and carefully over the past year, each one a small testament to the life she had built entirely without him. Seraphine, she said finally, what happened to the alliance? She released me from the arrangement, Cale said. Shortly after you left, she understood, faster than I did myself, exactly where my heart actually belonged, and she refused to spend her life as anyone's second choice. She was right to refuse that. No one deserves to be someone's quiet consolation, accepted only because the person they truly wanted was no longer available. No, Elira agreed softly. They don't. I'm not asking you to forgive me today, Cale said, turning to face her fully on the small stone bench, his expression carrying none of the practiced composure of a king, and all of the raw vulnerability of a man who had spent a year understanding exactly what he had lost. I understand that trust, once broken this badly, cannot simply be repaired through a single conversation, however honest. I'm asking only that you know the truth, finally, after a year of silence that should never have existed between us in the first place. And I'm asking whether there might be room, someday, for me to earn back some measure of the trust I so thoroughly failed to honor. Elira studied him for a long moment, feeling the weight of a year's worth of grief and healing and hard-won independence settling into the space between them, alongside something else, something she had not expected to feel again, after everything that had happened, a flicker of the warmth she had once believed in so completely. I built a life here, Cale, she said finally, a real one, work that matters, friends who value me honestly, without any crown or title attached to my worth, a garden I grew with my own hands, in soil that belongs to no kingdom at all. I am not the same woman who stood silently in your hall a year ago, too afraid to demand the honesty I deserved. I will not simply fold myself back into whatever future you now decide to offer me, however sincere your apology sounds today. I would never ask you to, Cale said quietly. I don't want the woman who stood silently in that hall, accepting whatever role I gave her without question. I want the woman sitting in front of me now, the one who built this entire life without needing me at all. If there is ever room for us again, Elira, it will only be because you choose it freely, on your own terms, with your eyes fully open to everything I failed to give you before. I am not here to reclaim you. I am here to prove, through whatever time it takes, that I am capable of choosing you as openly and honestly as you always deserved, whether or not that proof ever earns me a place in your life again. Elira said nothing for a long moment, the morning light filtering gently through the herb garden around them, and somewhere in the quiet that stretched between them, something that had felt entirely closed for the past year seemed to shift, just slightly, toward the possibility of something else entirely. "I need time," she said finally. "Not an answer today. Time to decide what I actually want, separate from whatever guilt or history exists between us." "Then I'll give you that time," Cale said, "for as long as you need it. I'll return to Millbrook, if you're willing to have me stay nearby, or I'll return home and wait for word, whichever you prefer. But I won't disappear from your life again without explanation, the way I let silence speak for me before. Whatever you decide, Alira, you deserve to hear it directly from me, clearly and honestly, for as long as it takes you to decide." Alira looked at him for a long moment, this man who had once broken her heart through silence, and had now traveled nearly a year and countless miles, to finally offer her the honesty she had always deserved, and felt, for the first time since leaving Ashgrove Castle, the beginning of something that might eventually, given enough time and enough proof, resemble the possibility of trust rebuilding itself from the ground up. "Stay in Millbrook," she said finally. "For now. We'll see what time actually reveals." It was not forgiveness. It was not the promise of a future either of them could fully claim yet. But it was, for the first time in a year, an honest beginning, built on truth rather than silence. And for Alira, standing in the garden she had grown entirely with her own hands, that felt like more than enough to start with. Cale stayed in Millbrook for 3 months before Alira allowed herself to fully believe that he intended to keep his word. He did not take a room at the inn and simply wait for her to come to him, the way she had half expected he might, accustomed as he was to people arranging their lives around his convenience. Instead, he found work with Torin at the forge, learning the blacksmith's trade, with the same disciplined focus he had once brought to swordsmanship and governance, his hands blistering and calloused within the first few weeks, in a way that told Alira, more clearly than any words could have, that he intended to build an honest place for himself in her world, rather than simply waiting for her to return to his. He sent word to Garrick and Bren, who managed the affairs of his kingdom in his absence with the careful competence of men who had served him long enough to handle a temporary regency without difficulty. He wrote letters to his advisors weekly, maintaining his responsibilities as Alpha King even from a distance, but he made no move to summon Alira back to Ashgrove Castle, no move to rush the slow, careful process of rebuilding trust that could not be hurried without risking everything he had traveled so far to repair. Alira watched him from a careful distance during those first weeks, still guarded, still uncertain whether the man standing at Torin's forge, sweat-soaked and covered in soot, bore any real resemblance to the king who had once let her stand silently in a crowded hall. But slowly, day by day, she began to notice small things that shifted her understanding of him. He never once used his rank to demand special treatment in Millbrook, choosing instead to earn his place among the townspeople through honest work and genuine effort. He joined the weekly meals Alira shared with Fenella and Torin, and the small collection of quiet outcasts who made up her found family in Millbrook, and rather than dominating the conversation the way a king accustomed to command might have, he listened, asked genuine questions, and slowly earned the town's trust through patience rather than authority. He never pressed her for more than she was willing to give. Some evenings, he simply sat with her in her garden as the sun set, saying little, content to share the quiet rather than fill it with words that might feel like pressure. Other evenings they talked for hours, working slowly through the year of separation between them, Alira finally voicing the depth of the hurt she had carried silently for so long, Cale listening without defending himself, without minimizing what she had endured, simply absorbing the full weight of what his silence had cost her. "I used to think," Alira told him one evening, several weeks into his stay, as they sat together in her garden, watching the last light fade from the sky, that loving someone meant accepting whatever they were willing to give, without ever demanding more. "I thought patience was a virtue, that waiting quietly proved the depth of my devotion. I understand now that patience without honesty is simply a slower kind of silence, and silence, however patient, is not love. It's just a comfortable way of avoiding the harder work of actually choosing someone, openly and completely." Cale was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with the careful seriousness he had brought to every conversation between them since his arrival. "You're right," he said finally. "I mistook your patience for permission, for a whole year before you left. and I never once stopped to consider what that patience was actually costing you. I won't make that mistake again, Alira. Whatever you decide about us, I intend to spend the rest of my life choosing honesty over convenient silence, in every relationship that matters to me, starting with this one, regardless of how it ends. Slowly, over the following weeks, something between them began to shift, from careful negotiation, toward something that felt, cautiously, like the beginning of trust rebuilding itself. Alira found herself looking forward to the quiet evenings in her garden, with an eagerness she had not expected to feel again. She found herself laughing, genuinely and without reservation, at small jokes Kale made while learning the finer points of blacksmithing from Torin, who had taken an unexpected liking to teaching a former king the value of honest physical work. But she did not rush the process, even as her guarded heart began, slowly, to soften toward the possibility of forgiveness. She had built too much in Millbrook, had fought too hard for the independence and self-worth she had discovered here, to simply abandon it for the comfort of a familiar affection, however genuine it now appeared to be. Kale seemed to understand this instinctively, never once pushing her toward a decision she was not ready to make, content to prove himself through consistent, patient action, rather than demanding she simply trust his words. 3 months into his stay, on a cold winter evening, with snow beginning to fall gently over Millbrook's quiet streets, Kale found Alira in the apothecary, closing up the shop after a long day of work, and asked if she would walk with him. They walked together through the softly falling snow to the edge of town, where the eastern trade route stretched out toward the horizon, the same road he had traveled nearly a year earlier, in his desperate search to find her. "I've been thinking," Kale said, as they stood together, watching the snow settle over the quiet landscape, "about what it actually means to choose someone properly, rather than simply loving them privately, while letting circumstance dictate the public shape of that love. I've spent 3 months here trying to prove, through action rather than words, that I understand the difference now. But there's one more thing I need to do, if you're willing, before I feel I've truly earned the right to ask for anything more from you." Alira turned to look at him, curious despite the careful guard she still maintained around her heart. "What is it?" "I've decided to restructure the succession plans for my territory," Kale said, "formally, publicly, in a way that removes any question of whether an alliance with your future, whatever that future holds, might someday require political convenience, rather than genuine choice. I've named Bren's eldest as my formal heir, publicly, before I traveled here, precisely so that whatever happens between us going forward, it happens because I choose you freely, without the weight of political necessity ever again forcing my hand the way it did before." Alira stared at him, genuinely startled by the magnitude of what he was describing. "Kale, that's an enormous decision. You would be changing the entire future of your kingdom." "I already have," Kale said quietly. "It's done. I made the announcement publicly, before I left Ashgrove Castle this time, so there could be no question of it being a private promise made, and quietly broken again, the way I once broke my promises to you. If you choose, someday, to return to my territory, it will be entirely your choice, unburdened by any political expectation that you must fill a role you never asked for. And if you choose to remain here in Millbrook, building the life you've already built so beautifully on your own terms, I intend to build a life alongside you here as well, whatever that looks like, wherever it takes place." Alira felt something in her chest finally, fully release, a tension she had carried for over a year, beginning to ease at last in the face of a gesture too significant to be anything other than genuine. "You would give up your kingdom," she said softly, "for the possibility of a future with me." "I already gave up nothing that mattered more," Kale said, turning to face her fully in the softly falling snow. "I understood, somewhere during this past year of searching for you, that a kingdom without honesty at its foundation was never worth as much as I once believed it to be. I want to build something real, Alira, with you, on whatever terms you're willing to offer, not because duty requires it, and not because political convenience demands it, but because I choose you, openly and completely, in a way I should have chosen you from the very beginning." Alira reached for his hand then, the first time she had voluntarily touched him since his arrival in Millbrook 3 months earlier, and felt the familiar warmth of his fingers closing gently around hers, patient and undemanding, waiting for her to set the pace of whatever came next. "I'm not ready to return to Ashgrove Castle," she said finally, her voice steady in the quiet, snow-filled evening. "Perhaps I never will be. Not fully. Not as the same woman who once stood silently in that hall, too afraid to demand what she deserved. But I am ready, I think, to build something new with you. Here, in this town where I found myself again, after losing everything I once believed I wanted. Then that is exactly where I intend to be, Cale said, and something in his voice carried a genuine, unguarded warmth she had not heard from him even during their most tender moments back at the castle. A warmth earned through a year of consequences and 3 months of patient, honest effort. Wherever you choose to build your life, Alira, I intend to build mine alongside it, as an equal partner, rather than a king expecting his healer to simply accept whatever role he decides to offer her. They stood together at the edge of Millbrook as the snow continued to fall softly around them. Two people who had each, in their own way, lost everything they once believed defined them, and had found, through loss and searching and painful, honest reckoning, something far more genuine than either of them had known how to build before. Alira Voss did not return to Ashgrove Castle that winter, or the winter after. She remained in Millbrook, tending her garden, and healing the town's sick and building, slowly and carefully, a life with a man who had finally learned to choose her openly, in full view of anyone who cared to see, rather than hiding their connection behind the safe, comfortable walls of private promises never spoken aloud. She was whole long before he ever found her, a truth she carried with quiet pride through every day that followed, and when she finally chose to let him fully back into her life, months after that snowy evening at the edge of town, it was not because she needed him to complete some part of herself that had gone missing during her year alone. It was simply because, having built an entire life on her own terms, strong and independent, and answerable to no one but herself, she found that she genuinely wanted him there beside her, not as a king and his healer, but as two equals, who had each learned, through considerable pain, exactly what honest love actually required. The garden behind the apothecary grew larger each year after that, tended by 2 sets of careful hands rather than one, and the small town of Millbrook, which had once simply offered a quiet stranger a place to rebuild herself from nothing, became, in time, the true home neither of them had ever quite managed to find within the walls of any castle at all.